so India has been training a large number of officers of the African armies, armed forces in India, and it has also deployed some training teams in countries within Africa, such as Botswana, which is supposed to be one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, and it's also relatively peace and stable. So that shows that, you know, that India's example of training the officers in the Botswana army obviously did something good. That Botswana survived despite the fact that it was surrounded by conflict-prone regions, Angola, some of its neighbors like Angola, Namibia, South Africa, had gone through a very bad security situation, and Botswana still survived. So just in case of an example of how India's support to capacity building and armed forces in Africa has supported peace in that region. Secondly, I would like to talk here about India's support to development of democratic institutions in Africa. So here I'm bringing this linkage that democracy promotes security, you know, that democracy leads to, there are several examples and empirical evidence which suggests that democratic countries do not have as many conflicts as non-democratic countries. So in that conceptual backdrop, you find that India has been involved in democratic assistance to a number of African countries, mainly through support in what you call voter education, or providing training to electoral officials in a number of African countries. Here, I would talk not just of South-South cooperation, but also triangular cooperation by bringing in the example of Institute of Democracy Election Management, which is set up under the Election Commission of India and is being supported by the UNDP and the Commonwealth of Nations. So this is a triangular initiative which is helping develop democratic institutions in Africa. And over the years since 2011, when it was set up, a large number of African countries officials from a large number of African countries have been trained in the IIDEM, and subsequently they have helped in, this has led to an increase in the capacities of these African countries, whether it is Kenya, which was the first country to get this training from Africa, and also countries like Namibia, which is, if you've been reading newspapers, they've been demanding the electronic voting machines from India. So involvement in elections, supporting the election assistance, providing election assistance has been one of the key roles of India in promoting peace and development in Africa. Third, I would like to bring here a case of a UN peacekeeping force, and that is the India's involvement in Liberia, and basically in terms of enhancing capacities of the local police force and supporting gender equality. I'm talking here about the 140 strong Indian contingent of police women, which was sent to Liberia in 2007 under the aegis of the UN peacekeeping mission of Liberia. But what is interesting to note here is that there are certain relative linkages to the model of South-South cooperation, because this was demand-driven. This idea of an all-woman police contingent in Liberia was demanded by the Liberian president at that point of time. And this was basically due to the situation within Liberia, which during the Civil War had faced massive sex crimes in the country, and the women force were really longing for some kind of security. And India's contingent over there gave some stability to the country, though it was just a 140 strong contingent. But what they triggered was the enhancement of the women in the National Police Force. The numbers of women police force in the Liberian government really increased fourfold due to the presence of the Indian police contingent in Liberia. So I think in terms of South-South cooperation or triangular cooperation, whatever you may call it, this serves an example of how India had helped in building local capacities and in supporting gender equality. So, so towards the end, I would like to leave you with the words of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who says that the core ideals of South-South cooperation is that South-South cooperation is a partnership, and it is beyond strategic concerns and economic benefits, and it's formed from emotional bonds and share a solidarity of what these countries feel against each other. I'm not really sure whether that is a true depiction, but that is the kind of view that India's leadership has at the moment about South-South cooperation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Ruchita, for this comprehensive overview of Indian activities in the area of peace building and conflict prevention or management with regard to training of armed forces, strengthening of democratic institutions and the electoral process, and also the specific example on UN peace building with a all-female contingent. I really find this fascinating, and I wonder maybe at some point later we can sort of refer or see if there are platforms where there could be some experience sharing and learning from each other with regard to these Indian experiences. With this, we turn to the final speaker, Dr. Kaustov, please.
Thank you, Professor Thomas, fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a terrific opportunity to deliberate with you on this topic. I was quite fascinated with one of the slides that Carlos flashed on the contribution of various countries in peacekeeping forces. And out of 5 top countries, 4 were South Asian countries. India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And the number 1 was Ethiopia. That's quite fascinating. Since Professor Ruchita and Carlos deliberated on the peacekeeping part of it, let me move this discussion to a different points. And I'll do this by highlighting 4 areas. One is to put the conflict and its sort of cost in the context. And what is the sort of global context of conflict, global extent of conflict and violence. I'll also argue for our age-old proverb, which is called prevention is better than cure. So focusing on the conflict prevention. And then I'll argue for a new paradigm for peace building, and then role of South-South cooperation. So just to put the things in context, you must have seen this report, but just to remind you, a recent report on the Global Peace Index in 2018 published by the Institute of Economics and Peace based in Sydney mentioned that in 2017, the average level of global peacefulness has deteriorated in 92 countries out of 163 countries that they ranked in the peace index. Predictably, the Middle East and North Africa, MENA region, remained the world's least peaceful region. But interestingly, Europe, which has been the world's most peaceful region for a long time, also deteriorated in peacefulness for 3 consecutive years. And similar trend is also found in South America. So these are, in a way, sort of revelation by this report. The global economic impact of conflict and violence was estimated to be mind-boggling, US dollar 14.76 trillion in 2017, which is equivalent to 12.4% of the global GDP, which means that every person per capita cost would be like 1,988. That's the cost of current global conflict in 2017. Can you imagine that 68% of the GDP in Syria is spent on conflict, managing a conflict. And so 63% for Afghanistan and 51% for Iraq. So that's the kind of context in which we are talking about peace building and conflict management. In the sort of preparation for this deliberation, I was going through some of the papers, and it was fascinating to also see that there is no dearth of wisdom to predict that which country or a sub-region within a subnational region would get into a conflict region. What are the early warnings? In all contexts, there was a sharp increase in inequality, economic, social, as well as political power between the subnational regions, either in the context of ethnicity or religions or religious sects, and people at large. So there's a clear-cut indicator where there is an increased inequality. Second is perception of being subject to blatant injustice by certain sections by the people. So that's a perception by majority of the people or minority of the people that they are facing some injustice. And then marked deterioration of or undermining of democratic institutions and processes, which otherwise these institutions mediate between different interest groups and therefore reducing the chance of conflict. And fourth one is the dramatic deterioration of civic liberty and spaces for civil society. So these are some early warnings which could be seen in more or less across the globe in all the conflict regions. So indeed, the inequality and exclusion manifest most starkly in political policy arena related to the access to political power and governance, land, water, extractive resources, delivery of basic services, justice and security. So it is possible to predict whether the countries or a sub-region within a nation could get into a conflict region. So what are the new paradigm for peace building? Within this understanding, there is now a kind of paradigm shift in the way peace building and conflict management strategies are now being considered. First of all, this is premised on the understanding that violence and conflict cannot be resolved by short-term partial solutions. And in the absence of institutions that provide people with security, justice, and developmental opportunities. So the point made by Mr. Deepak is very pertinent here. This is perhaps true that the primary responsibility for preventing action to conflict rests with the states, particularly through their national policies. However, in today's context, states are often one actor among many. And states are increasingly called to work with each other and with other actors to keep their countries on a pathway to peace. So it is the ability or inability of the state to work with a range of actors within the national context is extremely important. And this is possible when there is a strong democratic state in place which can sort of mediate and take into consideration the interest of various conflicting groups. The third one is the nexus between development, peace, and security. And this takes concrete form towards an inclusive approach to conflict prevention. The development dimensions must include economic, social, as well as political, particularly focusing on the strengthening democratic institutions. So the examples given by Ruchira of building institutions, strengthening democratic institutions in other countries becomes an important examples in the South-South cooperation. And the narrow prism of looking at security from a only military perspective must be sort of broadened enough to include the human security, along with, which has become increasingly important, is the environmental and climate change security, as well as energy security. And these are becoming sources of many international conflict. So this understanding is fortunately now fostered in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore, here comes the role of South-South cooperation. And all the southern countries are now subscribed to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in this framework that enables and which bestows upon the greater responsibilities to the southern countries, and thus greater relevance to South-South cooperation in the peace building and conflict management. So the emerging economies have become major players in provisioning tailored and long-term assistance to conflict-affected countries within the framework of South-South cooperation. There's an example of Brazil, example of South Africa, example of India are very pertinent here. And interestingly, all these three countries are democratic countries, and they are providing long-term support in many conflict-ridden countries. And there's its broader development cooperation growing. I mean, this is coming out of perhaps, the understanding that the broader development context would provide also a commercial interest, like, promoting trades, and that becomes one of the tools for promoting economic development. But also, the foreign policy aspiration for regional stability, and legitimately a bigger role in global governance. The emerging economies, particularly India, Brazil, South Africa, have promoted, as Ruchira was mentioning, some of the principles of South-South cooperation, which is in a way sort of alternative model and approaches that prioritizes national ownership and capacity building, and it is sort of intrinsically linked to the development cooperation approach, which has taken a human approach to peace building. And the last point is the emerging economies have also favored a consent-based and triangular intervention. So here comes the question of, Mr. Kala, you talked about where are the difficulties, in terms of putting in practice the principles of South-South cooperation, and non-interference becomes a barrier in that case. But there comes the question of the role of agencies like UN and other trilateral development, where a consensus building approach is generated through institutions like UN agencies. So just to conclude the process, my deliberation here is to say that it is possible within the normative principles of South-South cooperation to make investment for building peace in the long term. Let me stop here and be happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for your very important thoughts on the conceptual framing of peace building and conflict prevention, which then, and how they interlink with the principles of South-South cooperation. So we have some time left, and please let's have some statements, questions from the audience. We'll take a number of statements, and then we'll everybody here from the panel will have a chance to respond. 1, 2, 3. Who's got the microphones, please? The lady in the center. There, yes. Please kindly introduce yourself.
I'm Shireen, an entrepreneur from ID Solutions. So very good evening, all of you. And thank you so much for such a fascinating talk and discussion. So I want to know one thing. In this era of nuclear power, arms and wars, where US, the biggest arms exporter, is involved in almost in every war. So my question is like, how feasible or effective is this talk of peace building, peace management without big players like US, China, or Russia?
Okay, thank you. Very clear question. The gentleman here up in front, please.
Yeah, Dr. Balakrishnan, former ambassador. You mentioned about early warning of state breakdown, if you might say, precursor to a conflict. United Nations can't intervene. It has no mandate at that point. The only mechanisms which are available are, for example, through the ILO, and through labor conditions, conventions relating to freedom of association, trade union rights. If they are infringed, that provides a channel to intervene at in UN body. The other is the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights, where you have the periodic reviews. Apart from that, there is very little the UN can do at a precursor stage. Once a conflict situation arises, then there is the additional Protocol 2, the Geneva Convention, which is based on humanitarian principles. That is something which all countries of the South should support. Secondly, in a drastic case of state failure, I would think that we could invoke the mechanism of the Trusteeship Council. Rather than a coalition of X, Y, Z countries, the Trusteeship Council type of structure would have much more credibility and support than, for example, cases where in the Balkans, Yugoslavia broke up. It was a preferred solution of the EU. And now you have preferred solutions of Iraq and Syria, which are being pushed by one or other players, which are not going to be sustainable. So I'd like your reaction to that.
Okay, thank you. Pointing to the UN system and Trusteeship Council, which is dormant at the moment. The gentleman up here, the professor from South Africa.
Hello, 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 hello. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
It's much better.
Hello? Am I correct in there are different definitions between what Carlos presented and what Katsuf has presented in terms of measuring the violence and the conflict. You're measuring also internal violence, not conflict as defined by Carlos. But the difficulty is for us in our initiatives is naturalizing the concept of conflict management instead of framing it as regrettable that we have to go that way. Now, 4 little points. If peace is the end of wars, there has been no war or military intervention in the last 30 years that has led to peace. In fact, it escalated things. Secondly, that interests of armament and disarmament are in direct conflict these days. The vast expenditures on military R&D to land a bomb in the middle of my head because of my genetic material and all that research that is going on cannot be developing things that will lie fallow or dead in the future because these are major investments. So the fact that a firm that produces hazmat suits, body bags, and refugee tents has some of the highest returns of investment in the world makes the situation even more complex. third little point is that, yes, we understand in Africa and in Southern Africa that there were armed groups that thought that violence could be cathartic, including the ANC, at a certain point of the history, as opposed to, let's call them Neo-Gandhian movements from Nyerere to Nkrumah and others, where non-violent action. The turning point in South Africa, as we all know, was the decision and the realization that violence could not be cathartic and move towards reconciliation and also disarmament and other things. Now, this idea of violence could be cathartic creates victors and victims and more armed groups and more troublesome people for regimes and more sales for arms that have been escalating at the same time. So all I'm trying to say is that unless, like in Europe, or like inside South Africa, the past was constituted as regrettable, and therefore one could proceed in countries that killed more people than anyone else on earth to be able to have a Pacific Europe over a few years after devastating wars. You know, it was possible, it was done. So that all that was regrettable. We will not be able to construct a moral South-to-South cooperation. It will be a pragmatic one. End of comment.
Thank you very much. We would still have time for one or two more statements. That's not the case. We'll just come back to the panel, and you have the opportunity now to respond. Let's reverse the order, so we'll start with Dr. Kausdorff, please.
Thank you so much for these reflections. What I was sort of referring to an approach towards prevention of conflict, even and much early warning, using much early warning system, but also making investment that conflict does not arrive in first place. So the approach was more developmental approach where if you look at how do we reduce the inequalities within the societies at the national and subnational context. And there comes the question of making South-South cooperation work. Of course, the responsibilities would be with the national government within their overall national developmental framework and the policy framework, but South-South cooperation with the development compact that we talk about can bring in more nuance development there, which can reduce inequality, poverty, and deprivation. And that would in a way sort of neutralize first conditions for having a conflict. Second is, of course, building strong democratic institutions, but not to stop there. Building capacities of the civil society, building capacities of citizens, so not only to support the representative democracy, but also building a participatory democracy within the society. So these are more preventive action, long-term actions towards addressing the question of preventing conflict even arise at the first place. Coming to, I don't think there was a difference in the definition, but Carlo talked about his presentation, but I think we emphasize two different aspects of the conflict. One is the conflict between countries, which is of an international nature, but I focused more on the subnational conflict. But having said this, many a times there is a dynamics between international conflict and the subnational conflict. And subnational conflict often has a tendency to transcend the boundaries of the state border and to involve other countries, or vice versa. The international conflict can also initiate a subnational conflict. So conceptually speaking, they may feed each other in a bad way. So I don't see the definitional differences, but it's a continuum or dynamism that we need to understand.
Thank you, Professor Ruchita.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very interesting the way the discussion is going. And I would like to take on some of the points which were made by some of the questions that were raised. First, the question about early warning mechanisms and that the UN does not have, but other regional organizations like the African Union do have an early warning mechanism. They do have a panel of wise to deal with these issues. I'm not really sure how far it has really worked in the case of Africa, but there are mechanisms, because in Africa, they have moved away from non-intervention towards a policy of non-indifference. So pragmatically, that's what they call for in terms of a resolution, an early resolution to a conflict. So there are several examples within Africa of how some of the regional organizations and in individual countries have been involved in conflict prevention, and maybe some of our participants here from Africa could tell us about that. But I would like to bring in the example of the IGAD, which has been involved in South Sudan in supporting capacity building of the Sudanese civil servants in terms of enhancing their governance capacities and thereby reducing the chances of conflict, because it's a new nation and it needs to develop that. That's an important initiative. And the 3 countries which have been seconding their officials, Kenya, Uganda, and I'm not sure which is the 3rd country, but there are 3 African countries from the region which are basically involved in this. So this is again another example of how South-South cooperation is working. Secondly, this whole talk about reconciliation that you're talking of in terms of South Africa, but I'm not really sure that it's really working even now. In terms of South Africa, it is, but there are South Africa has several individuals which are working on a counter purpose. So you have mercenaries, which have cases of mercenaries being involved in, say, the conflict in settled African Republic, mercenaries of South African origin. So how do you deal with situations like that? Of course, the South African government has brought about a new model of reconciliation and conflict resolution, but how can it control the private citizens within its borders and their dealings with it? Second important aspect is about the whole issue of the fact that US is the largest exporter of arms, and how can you promote South-South cooperation in peace and conflict management if US is not on board, which is true. In fact, US is the largest arms manufacturer. Its whole economy is based on manufacturing. So obviously there has to be some kind of mechanism among the southern countries in the global south to deal with these countries which are involved in promoting armaments, whether it is US or whether it is countries within Europe or China, which talks about building security in Africa, but also is one of the largest supplier of small arms to the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we need to rush up a little bit, because in 2 minutes the next meeting will take place downstairs. So Mr. Deepak, please. No? Okay, thank you. And then we have the Carlos.
Just very quickly regarding what gentleman from South Africa said, reminds me of a very interesting article from Lutwak called "Give War a Chance." It's very interesting. I recommend reading. Thank you.
Okay, well, reflect on that one. And now, Mr. Dennis, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. there was mention of mechanisms in the United Nations system, including organs of the United Nations like the Security Council. I think these have existed, and what we're trying to say today is that the member states in the South can build upon the mechanisms that exist to promote peace and conflict prevention. And in this regard, I wanted to give a quick example of a number of fragile states that have been working to promote peace. They're called fragile to fragile states. And the idea is that they share experiences in terms of preventing conflicts from breaking out. And I think this is an example of what we're trying to say. As you say, the mechanisms are there. There are big countries exporting weapons and so on. But what can the South of tomorrow help in terms of bringing about peace? And I think the answer lies with the countries of the South. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please join me in giving a hand to the panelists for a great session. And thanks to all those that put up the questions and that listened and shared the session with us. Thank you.